Hello and welcome to Bangalore International Centre's very own podcast, BIC Talks. Bangalore International Centre is a platform for informed conversations, exchange of ideas, and a space for arts and culture. BIC Talks brings the essence of all that the physical space stands for and more to your doorstep.
Hi, I'm Pavan Srinath and welcome to BIC Talks. This is the second of two episodes where on BIC Talks we talk about trans rights, trans lives and the long road to true gender inclusion and equity in India. Previously on episode 27, lawyer Jayna Kothari had spoken to Tejas AP about the important legal judgments in India that have promoted trans rights, the recent efforts at necessary decriminalization, and how in 2020 we need to move beyond just that and work towards equality, have an equality law, and perhaps positive rights for gender minorities. Tejas AP returns to BIC Talks today to anchor our second episode with Bittu. Bittu is an associate professor of biology and psychology and a genderqueer trans man who believes in the annihilation of caste, class, and gender. Bittu, welcome to BIC Talks.
Thank you for having me.
And Tejas, welcome back, and over to you.
Thank you, Pavan. My previous conversation with Jayna Kothari made me think about the centrality of asserting one's identity in the quest of a dignified life. We, the LGBTQIA+ community, are quite unique, and we must identify as such to seek parity, protection, or respect in the eyes of society, law, and administration. But in order to do so, a person needs to be able to freely self-identify first. For example, I am a cisgender man and I am gay. My struggle is to make those around me understand how I define those two identities simultaneously. I define my masculinity and my homosexuality for myself, period. When a person is not allowed to do that, it puts them at a fundamental disadvantage in their ability to seek a desired life. So, in order to further the conversation in respecting the rights and lives of gender and sexual minorities, we must understand their struggles better. These struggles are social as much as they are legal. And this is what our conversation today is going to be about. We will talk about the need to self-identify, the implications of not being allowed to do so, and a possible way forward for the transgender community. Bittu, welcome to BIC Talks. Please tell me about the many ways in which the transgender community expresses its gender identity and what sort of problems does the community encounter doing so?
The problems that the community encounters will be better understood by speaking to people in the community who come from, who face multiple marginalizations around sexuality, gender, caste, class, and disability. Because my experiences, my caste and class privilege really protect me from many of the worst, most demeaning, violent and humiliating interactions with society that the typical trans person in the community faces. And the typical trans person, like the typical person in our country, is working class, Dalit, Adivasi or Bahujan. And so I think it's important to bear that in mind. Of course, I can broadly say, speaking for the community at large, that from others, and to some small extent faced myself, there are several experiences of intense violence on the one hand, and systematic exclusion from livelihood, housing, and healthcare on the other. And every day is filled in with thousands of microaggressions from people who think that they have the right to dictate, as per social rules, what you should and should not do on account of what they perceive to be your gender rather than your self-identified gender. So I think it is a very vast set of experiences that's hard, certainly for me especially, to summarize.
Thank you so much. And I just wondered if you would be able to elaborate a little bit more on some of the microaggressions that you referred to in your response earlier.
Well, one common microaggression that many of us face is just not being gendered properly. So if one tells people, this is my name, this is my gender, that you're repeatedly referred to in the gender that you were assigned. If somebody doesn't know your dead name, then that's a different thing. But very often one is in some sense put in one's place. There are microaggressions all the time of the kind that involve, there's certainly repeated forms of daily exclusion where people would like to where people just are unsure of how it will be to have a relaxed conversation in which their bigotry goes unchallenged in front of you. And the other thing that is hard for me to say personally is that my experiences as a trans person and as an activist are conflated together. I don't know whether what I experience from people is based on that activism or is based on my being a trans person. It's hard for me to tell these two things from one another, but both of these factors play into my personal experiences.
So, Bittu, given that cisgender people in positions of power are so crucially involved in the decision-making process that affects transgender lives, how sensitive to these concerns do you find them to be?
I mean, I think it's hard to generalize across cis people, but I will say that it typically requires a fair bit of interaction with the trans community to understand just how painful kind of business as usual is. But I will say that there are a lot of really fantastic cis allies who educate themselves and are ready from day one, even if they've never met a trans person. They're ready and prepared for how to be sensitive. And so I will say that I have met, while of course the vast majority of cis people are not sensitive, I have met a really large number of fabulous and very stunningly fabulous allies.
That's great to know, actually. I was thinking about this because in your position as an activist, you must interface a lot with public officials who sort of interface with you as an activist who's taking concerns of the community to them, right? And sort of trying to negotiate or broker some sort of solutions that help them understand your concerns better, the community that you represent, their concerns better, right? So, this question to me kept coming up when I was speaking to Jayna Kothari as well in my earlier conversation, that it is great to know that there are judges in high courts, which is what she mentioned, who have been fantastic in their understanding of the concerns of the transgender community. So do you think that this has been a sort of systematic effort that a lot of public officials have been taking up? Is it because of their increased interaction with the civil society, so that they can get better sensitized?
Well, I find that the higher up people are in general in positions of power, the less willing they are to listen to people, which is unfortunate. But I do think that there are a small number of public officials who, even if they're not willing to listen, they are interested in helping. The problem is often they're interested in helping in whatever way they think help is needed, rather than listening to what it is that people would like them to do. But at least some of them can be persuaded to understand all of the ways in which they need to listen first in order to be effective policymakers. Sometimes that involves some stroking of egos and some telling them, look, everyone is interested in doing something, quote unquote, especially around trans persons, but very few people listen, and so they end up making policy that we object to. So if you listen, that's what's going to make you a successful advocate. That's what's going to make you the person whom we can get behind. And that approach sometimes helps sort of make them realize that really the first step is listening. And the reason listening is important is because, to be honest, it is not easy for a person who is not trans to understand someone who is. This is because trans experiences themselves are varied, but also because our narratives are somewhat simplified in order to fit within what we think of as the confines of the understanding of somebody who does not share the trans experience. So, these narratives that we also package for cis people, and especially for people in positions of power and administration and in government, these can also often lead to their sort of misunderstanding or making assumptions from the particular people whom they meet about the community overall. I think the rules, if you want to be a courteous cis person who is engaging with trans persons, are very, very simple. They're not complicated at all. And that is, if you are meeting a trans person, or actually if you're meeting any person, don't assume their gender or name. Just ask them, what is your name? What are your pronouns? What is your gender identity? And then just stick to that, right? And don't make assumptions. Just ask and stick to that. And so I think that's sort of the very simple way in which a cis person can courteously interact with a trans person. But to make policy for trans people is not simple. And one does need to know a lot more before one makes policy. Now, the simple way to do this quickly so that everyone doesn't have to get a massive education before they make policy is to convene the community together and the whole community together, not the particular subset that you might have met. We're not such a large community that it's prohibitively difficult to convene us together. And ask people what they would like, right? Ask people to together evolve a policy that will work for them. There are several policy documents that have already emerged from such processes before, and they can refer to those. So I think that really ensuring that communities who are marginalized lead the way collectively on policies that impact them. This is something I think that the government should learn, not just for trans people, but for policy making more generally.
So in my conversation with Jayna Kothari, she spoke at length about the progressive provisions of the nutsert judgment. How well would you rank the nutsert judgment as indicative of the desires of the trans community in what they seek from the judiciary?
Well, I'm not a fan of ranking, but I will say that the nutsert judgment's executive decisions, right, are a very useful set of executive decisions. And I think we have been able to, the trans community has really benefited from implementing them, from interpreting them and so on. But I will say that text of the Nalsa judgment is all over the place, right? It meanders, it includes various statements which are not true, contradicts itself. And so I would say that's not particularly representative of what we want from the trans community's perspective. So it's really the sort of takeaway, the directions of the judgment, I think, that have been extremely useful, as well as some of the text within the judgment. But I would not say that the judgment overall is what we would want it to.
So what part of the judgment do you find quite useful?
The decisions, right? At the very end, there's a series of, I think, 8 or 9 things which the Nalsa judgment mandates, including kind of upholding self-identification of gender. For example, saying that it is both immoral and illegal for governments to ask for proof of surgery before accepting someone's claim to a gender identity. These are, I think, very useful directions that were issued. And of course, there are others around healthcare, around education, and so on. But I think that these directions were really the most important when it comes to...
And in your experience as an activist or sort of networking with other activists in other states, what has the reception from state governments been like in implementing the provisions of the Nalsa judgment?
It's varied. I think in many states, the fight for rights really went up after the Nalsa judgment, even if governments haven't exactly caught up. Some governments have moved on some aspect of trans rights, while others haven't. There was a slow process of setting up state welfare boards that preceded the Nalsa judgment, but there have also been some that have formed after. I don't know whether they were formed because of the judgment, but they certainly formed because of a process that included several activists lobbying around the judgment and essentially pointing out that states would be in contempt of court if they did not respond to some of those provisions. I think that some state governments have moved, some other non-state governmental agencies like the UGC moved after the Nalsa judgment. So I think a lot of government agencies, including a non-binary column on their forms, happened after the Nalsa judgment. Unfortunately, the problem is that a lot of government agencies think that that's all trans people want. We want some third gender category. And that's not true. There are certainly some trans people who would want a third gender category. What it should be called varies across people in the community. So some people want it to be called third gender. Some people want it to be called trans. Some people would like it to be a non-binary category. So, these are all the possible ways that could play out. But a lot of trans persons do not want a third category. They would just like to have barrier-free access to the categories that they identify with. And that, I think, is something that the Nalsa judgment confers right on, but that many of these bodies have not implemented. Right? So, for example, the UGC has not implemented ways by which, say, a male-identified person can get their educational degrees, either past degrees remade in their chosen name or gender, or in many cases even fresh degrees issued in chosen names or genders, depending on the bureaucracy of the educational institution and their certifying board. So I think that some things have moved and others have not. These are the kinds of things that an act of government would have and could have moved along, and the Trans Act promises to move on this question of consistency of documents. Unfortunately, completely contradicts the Nalsa judgment, erodes the right to self-identification, and places all power to certify trans people as trans in the hands of the government, reintroduces surgery as a criterion for binary gender identification, and so on.
I'm really glad you brought up the Trans Act 2019 because I was hoping if you'd be able to explain what the provisions of the Act are and in what ways do they go against the spirit of sort of rights that the community seeks.
So there are some regressive provisions in the Act as well. For example, the provision of a 6-month to 2-year sentence for all forms of physical sexual assault, verbal assault, and so on upon trans persons. Even if this is read and interpreted as adding on to existing judgments or existing provisions of law, the IPC only quantifies sexual violence against women, loosely defined, in fact, really badly defined in the IPC, and says that those sexual violence against a woman can give you a punishment of minimum of 7 years and a maximum of life. This means that if a trans person who's not considered to be a woman in terms of their categorization by the state, and certainly all these various people who the state is seeking to place in a trans transgender category, that essentially they would be a second class of citizen who do not have the same rights of recourse around the same acts of violence that might be committed against a cisgender woman simply by virtue of being trans. So these are problematic provisions. Furthermore, the Act also treats trans persons as children, saying that using language from borrowed legislation that are on transgender or rather gender non-conforming children. And it says that trans persons must live with their families or approach a court to live in a rehabilitation shelter home. And of course, this violates our fundamental rights as, adults in our constitutional rights. And so it will not withstand a constitutional challenge in court. But this is the kind of shoddy rulemaking that has gone into the making of this draft. Now the rules have come out for the Trans Act, which are even more laughable. The draft rules that the government has put out are just ridiculous. They suggest that trans persons, when you apply to the government to be recognized as trans, in the forms, the one thing that you don't actually fill in is your gender. The government has filled in for you your gender, and the only gender you can apply to be recognized as is transgender. And so how is this, even the Act sort of has a little nod to the Nalsa judgment saying the applicant, trans persons are going to have rights to self-perceived gender. But how do you have a right to self-perceived gender if the government provides you with a form in which they ask you incredibly intrusive questions about whom you're living with and what your HIV status is? But the one thing which they're supposed to ask you, because this is only supposed to be a form in which you apply to have your gender recognized by the state, is filled in by the state itself. It says, I am, and then gender identity, ... and then the state has filled in transgender. Just laughable. And we object to that enumeration form, which asks a lot of intrusive, unnecessary questions about our personal lives. The government's just using it as a data collection exercise. And we ask that people self-identify however they want, and that gender then be applied to educational documents, etc. And if people would like to change their gender, they can always conform to change their gender as in away from their initial self-identified gender. Then you can have modification of the other proposals or the other forms proposed by the government. But people should right away have the right to self-identify gender regardless of their status of surgery, hormones, etc.
Thank you, Bittu, for this incredibly insightful response. And it just makes me wonder, how did this process come about that led to an act that fundamentally does not take into consideration the desires and needs of the community that it seeks to represent?
Good question. I think that this government has a long history of deciding what they think minority communities need and then imposing it on minority communities, thinking that they are being saviors and turning out to be incredibly harmful. And I think stabbing minority communities in the back by imposing majoritarian notions of what should be is just what this government does.
As I understand, you were involved in the process of consultations that the transgender community took to the government, right? When the government sort of asked for responses from the community. Could you talk a little bit about your involvement in that process?
This wasn't really an involvement in a process so much as my monitoring the government websites for when they would put out public calls for the community to get involved. And then my notifying all the communities I knew who were not privy to this information that they could organize an intervention into the process at various times and helping them sort of come to Delhi, set up these meetings, depose, for example, before the Standing Committee of the Parliament, where we organized 6 depositions from trans community leaders from different states, and so on and so forth. And remember that these are all unfunded efforts, so this was trans persons funding themselves to come and intervene on matters that were decisions that were being made about them that would affect them were not being made by them.
And how did the Standing Committee members respond to the depositions that were made by the community members?
I thought they responded quite well, actually. Pleasantly surprised. They listened, by itself surprising. And I think, I'm not sure what else I expected from them, but they listened.
So what happened between the listening and the drafting of the law?
Standing Committee produced a beautiful report that incorporated all of our concerns, and the government, which had set up the Standing Committee, as a matter of course, just ignored all of the Standing Committee's recommendations. The Standing Committee's final report says, we recommended X, Y to the government after having heard from the trans community, and the government said no. We recommended ABC to the government, And the government said no. So this is what that sounded like. The entire report disregarded by the government. And that's the point at which I think we realized that if the government was going to be so arrogant and completely ignore a standing committee where, again, the majority of people who are on a standing committee on minority affairs are BJP members. It's not even members from other parties for them to disregard their own standing committee, in which their own party was well represented. Of course, the minority members of their party, so a large number of basically Dalit, Adivasi, Bahujan lawmakers from their parties. But that if those concerns could be swept aside so readily, that were studied by this committee, framed by the committee and so on, then I realized that they were certainly not going to listen directly to voices of the community. So it really indicated what they think of minority communities, including caste minorities and marginalized community minorities within their party.
So today, the rejection of the act from the transgender community is quite well acknowledged and well documented. But if it had to be rewritten, what kind of provisions would make it into the act? If this had to be drafted by the community together, what would the act read like?
Well, there is a sample legislation that was drawn with community input, and that is Tirchi Siva's bill, which was presented and passed as a private member's bill by the Rajya Sabha, and that was then taken to the Lok Sabha, where this government sort of pulled a somewhat dirty trick. They passed their own bill in the Lok Sabha before considering Tirchi Siva's bill, and they could only do so by claiming that their bill was substantially different from Tirchi Siva's. Having passed their own bill and taken it to the Rajya Sabha, they got Tirchi Siva's bill dropped by claiming the opposite, which is that their bill was largely similar to Tirchi Siva's bill, and therefore that after their bill had been passed, there was no need to consider a second bill. But his bill reflects a lot of what it is that the community wants. We need, the only useful thing that the government can do for us at this stage is to provide reservation around trans identity to combat the fact that no person wants to take a trans person as a worker in their homes, in their factories, in their workspaces. And so the only way that's going to change is through reservation. This is the stated purpose of reservation, to sort of flag bear what it is that workspaces should look like in terms of social justice and really in terms of combating historical injustice. So that's something that should be in a legislation. There should be comprehensive anti-discrimination measures. Discrimination needs to be defined. There should be anti-atrocity measures. There are very specific kinds of atrocities that trans persons face. And all of these need to be quantified and spelled out and addressed in such an act. And of course, there have to be comprehensive welfare measures. There needs to be, it's also slightly ridiculous to talk about welfare measures for trans persons in a country where the government does not provide welfare measures for most people. But yes, there should be, healthcare should be a free good provided by the state to all persons, including trans persons. And there should be a sort of housing which trans persons face exclusion from, access to public spaces, public transport, and so on. All of these need to be guaranteed in such an act. I think housing, medical, education, livelihood. These core things need to be emphasized. And of course, the government should also take on offer possibilities for trans persons to create sensitization modules, paid kind of work for the trans community to ensure that awareness is spread in all places, including in all schools, and so on, to change the status quo.
Does awareness around sensitivity towards issues of transgender persons exist more at the district or state level than sort of what might be considered a center mandate coming down?
Oh, absolutely. I think Tamil Nadu, for example, having pioneered trans persons there, having really pioneered the fight for trans rights, Tamil Nadu government really sort of took some of these steps before anyone else, and that also comes from the history of the Periyarite movement there and the self-respect movement there, taking trans persons really carving a role for themselves in that movement and thereby pushing the state to do a lot more than has been done either centrally or in other states. And various other states have caught up since then. It's very clear that in the south, there's just a lot more. For example, all of the southern governments, really except Telangana AP, have formed strongly functioning, well-functioning welfare boards. Maharashtra just formed one, although without any trans men present on it at all. No intersex persons, no non-binary persons on that board, just trans women. And there are also boards in a few other states across India. So we see that people are able to lobby more effectively at the state level than at the central level.
So we've been speaking a lot about the legal recourse to rights for minority individuals. But I guess I'm also thinking about, are rights enough to secure the kind of life that members of a community can aspire to? Is a rights-based discourse sufficient to sort of gain access to a dignified life that the transgender community aspires to? What more needs to be done, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Yeah, I mean, I think rights-based discourses always have their limitations. Firstly, the question of rights is often hotly contested by itself. And so I think that the notion of justice is something that is always, one can always define it in one's isolated kind of ivory towers, but really in practice, these are defined by various acts of social contestation. And it's a fight that's going to continue at various levels. I think I'm worried about the ways in which the community is also shifting towards the right wing. I find that the right-wing sort of governments have managed to persuade small but influential sections and persuade with money and with various lures of state power to really support their agenda, which is essentially an anti-minority agenda. So I do worry and find that they are trying to play minority communities against one another. And these are all various shifts and contestations that I am worried about. But I think that is the nature of the struggle that we're in, and we will have to find new ways to organize.
So what do you see as the next step forward for the transgender community now that the Act is here to stay along with its rules?
Well, there are going to be legal challenges to the Act. Those will happen side by side. But once the rules are finalized, and I think there's still scope for the rules to be intervened with so that they're not as bad as they currently stand, but that would require the trans community to really come together around it. One finds that divisive dynamics in the community have already begun, because once the government ratifies the rules and the Act is in force, there is the potential, we don't know whether the government will realize that potential, but there will be a lot of pressure on the government from the various people whose silence around the bill has been bought by promises of access to that money. Various NGOs are going to be standing with their begging bowls outside government offices saying, let the money flow, right? And those dynamics, that flow of money, all of that is then going to change the community. It's going to change power dynamics, which are already variously skewed. They are going to change. One of the reasons that the Act has also come down on the community so strongly is because the community has always been a syncretically Hindu and Muslim community. And I can already see the saffronization of the community in that people feel either that they need to hide their Muslimness or play up their Hinduness or just give in to this government's kind of very stark preference for one aspect of that identity. And I think that that's interesting. It's these dynamics going forward will really constrain what it is that the trans community can do as a collective in the wake of the trans. We'll have to see how that goes. The legal challenges are quite straightforward. 3 or 4 have already been filed, and those will go forward.
So I guess for any movement to work really well, I think you've also mentioned earlier about the crucial role of allies. So what does a good ally to the transgender community look like? As
I said, a simple sort of way in which an ally can be respectful of a trans person is to just respect somebody's name and gender and consistently address them in the name and gender that they identify with. That's something very simple that people can do. But to be a good ally, one needs to do more than that in terms of supporting the struggle for trans liberation. And that involves really seeing all of the exclusions of trans persons that exist in your communities that allies inhibit, whether they are living communities or educational communities or livelihood communities, sort of spaces, and breaking all of those. The greatest problem that trans people face in India is an unwillingness of people to employ them. So find employers who will take on trans persons and talk to your employers, talk to your workspaces, talk in your residential spaces, create spaces for trans persons. That's something that's essential for allies to do with us.
In your observation, do you feel like there are certain kinds of, say, industries or certain sort of locations where creating a space for trans community has worked out better than others?
I think it has depended a lot on the people in those spaces. So I think that I found some really so for example, one of the spaces that was just extremely liberating for several trans activists was the community at Ijipura who was evicted by this Garuda Mall. Garuda Mall, which many of you would know if you're in Bangalore, is a large mall, and the owner of that mall, Garudachar, had wanted to have access to this large public government land on which a large slum had been built in Ijipura, and the community living on that land was then targeted for eviction. Many of us who went to support the residents and join their struggle against this forced eviction were trans persons. And the community there was just beyond what we had ever experienced in any of our lives in terms of trans friendliness. Many of us didn't even have to have the conversation saying we were trans without even really, asking. Many of them said, for example, to a trans man like me, you are my brother, and just treated me that way, called me Anna. This was a affirming trans environment that I found. I'm also currently in a very trans-affirming space at my university at Ashoka, where my students really universally ensure and really militate and ensure that nobody from among the student community misgenders me. And I think it's incredible that they have created that. But I think it's interesting to point out both of these examples, because if I were to say I found such a space in a university, this fits within people's mindset of what a liberal elite space would look like, without understanding that the Ijipura community was far more liberating for me, because it was universal adults, older people who still at Ashoka, there are some older people who misgender me. But at Ijipura, the adults sort of uniformly all got it. And it was, I don't know whether people in this country even have interactions across castes and class and communities, so that they meet people like the incredible people in Ijipura who are now, continue several years after the displacement in 2013 to be displaced on the road right outside the area where they were evicted. But these were the very fine people who gave me my first community experience of trans liberation.
This is quite interesting, because this is still a bit of an uphill battle for many people who are from the LGBT community, who one would imagine have had sort of more exposure to members of the transgender community. I often find that this is a more difficult thing for the LGBT community, the lesbians, gays and bisexual members of the community, to understand that misgendering is actually not okay, and to gender someone properly is really quite easy. To remember someone's name is quite easy. Do you find that disappointing that those who are sort of lumped together under LGBT can't sort of respect each other in the most fundamental manner?
Yeah, ideally the LGBT community needs to lead the way in doing this. It's unfortunate that doesn't always happen, but I do think that we need to take the lead on that. And
on that sort of thoughtful note, I would sincerely like to thank you for your time and insights. Bittu, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening in till the end. Please share this episode with a friend on social media, WhatsApp, or anywhere else. It would mean the world to us. And in case you're listening via iTunes or Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and a review. Subscribe to BIC Talks on email or your favorite podcast app, and don't miss out on future episodes. This episode of BIC Talks has Gaurav Krishna as our sound engineer, with support from S. Sarvanaraj and Lekha Naidu. And the accompanying episode artwork was made by Chandni Venkataraman.
Thank you for listening to this episode of BIC Talks. This podcast can be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org, as well as on any of your favorite podcast platforms. Tune in for new episodes every week, and do subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages to stay informed on our latest updates.